All right. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is the third Kasten by Veeam Cube series, as we call them, webinar for this year. Time flies by. My name is Tom Leyden. I'm in charge of marketing here at Kasten, and I will be your host, but most of the speaking will be done by Krista and Gaurav. So really excited to have Krista Macumber. She's a senior analyst at the Evaluator Group, and Gaurav Rishi, who is VP of Products here at Kasten. In this webinar today, Krista will be covering some of the findings of her new research paper, Risks and Considerations for Container Native Data Protection. And she will be outlining some options for protecting Kubernetes environments. Gaurav joined us to help us with some container native data protection best practices and some real world approaches to protecting Kubernetes data. Before I hand it off to Krista and Gaurav, I want to go through some practicalities. Everybody except myself, Krista and Gaurav will be muted. But we still want this webinar to be very interactive, and we got a very good start on that. So that was awesome. So whenever you have questions, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your app. Please submit your questions and as many as you wish in the Q&A box. We have a team here that will be addressing your questions, and the most interesting questions I will ask Krista and Gaurav at the end of the session, and that will also be a time to post some follow-up questions if you have any. So interaction is key here. There will also be a couple of polling questions coming from us. They will show up on your screen, and they will help us to tailor the content of these webinars to your needs. So it would really be awesome if you could answer those questions. If you don't want to, you can also skip, of course, no obligations. And then finally, to thank you for the time that you're putting into this or into attending this webinars. All of the attendees are getting a free copy of the paper that Krista and her team wrote. And one lucky attendee will be getting a $200 gift card in a live raffle. To win the card, you have to be present at the end of the webinar, and we will be announcing the winner at the end of the session. So stay tuned for that. Also, a recording of the webinar and the slides will be made available for you guys to watch them on demand or pass them on to coworkers if that's any useful. So with any further ado, Gaurav, Krista, would you like to kick it off here?
Thanks, Tom. This is fantastic, and happy to see so many people join in. And I have an easy job today because Krista is always a delight to sort of talk to, and also she's extremely knowledgeable about the entire data protection industry. I know, Krista, you've been doing this for a long time, and I definitely enjoy reading and getting the insights. So I'm glad that we get a chance to have you share this with a wider audience. So my job really today is to make sure that we can eke out as much information as possible as time allows from you over the next 45 minutes or so. But maybe a good way to start, Krista, was going to be if you can just give us a high-level snapshot of what the container and Kubernetes adoption are like in the organizations and what's really causing that adoption. I know it's up and to the right, but maybe if you can add a little more color to that.
Absolutely, Gaurav, and thank you so much to you and Tom for such a warm welcome. It's always a real pleasure to speak with you guys and similar to kind of learn from your experience as well. And really appreciate all the folks on the line joining today. I think we can, as you know, we kind of did go through the agenda. So I'll share in just a second here a chart from a primary research study that we fielded mid to late last year, which did show that enterprises are well on their way to adopting containers and Kubernetes. And in fact, what was really interesting was actually adopting them for production use cases. So outside of kind of some of those, maybe test and dev use cases that we were more familiar with seeing, more earlier on in the adoption of Kubernetes. So I'll show this chart here, and I'll give just a few seconds for folks to kind of take a look at it before really digging in. And now, so this feedback, it comes from IT infrastructure clients, again, that we surveyed last year. And if you look at the percentage of respondents that either were considering or were using containers in production, that figure is about 85%. And that comes from those top 3 blue bars there. So obviously that was very significant. And in particular, if we look at that middle blue bar there, we saw that 31% of respondents said that they were already using Kubernetes in production. And actually only 5%, which is the second green bar there, said that there was no use for containers or that they would be using a platform other than Kubernetes to manage their container environments. So again, certainly we are seeing that adoption for production use cases is there. And with the survey, we wanted to go a step further and sort of understand how Kubernetes was being adopted into production. So for this next chart here, that's what we asked. And again, I'll give maybe just a few seconds for folks. I know that there's kind of quite a bit of text with the chart. I'll give a few seconds to sort of digest it. When we do look at Kubernetes, we would expect to see sort of a strong linkage between Kubernetes and cloud native applications. And if we look at the top blue bar here, we did see that about 24% of respondents said that they were using Kubernetes in order to deploy cloud native applications into production. So significant and certainly what we'd expect. To me, what was almost more telling here was these 2 bars that I've flagged with the yellow arrows. So this signifies the percentage of customers that are using containers to transition either some or all of their VMware environments, really to sort of a containerized or microservices architecture. If we tally up those 2 bars, it's actually 46%. So close to 50% of respondents said essentially that they're refactoring VMware applications, right? That might be some of those more traditional production workloads to container environments. So it's certainly not just some of those, net new kind of cloud native applications that we would expect to see.
Yeah, no, I think this is fascinating. Sorry, go ahead, Krista. Didn't want to stop you there.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to point out that it seems like a really healthy mix of, we talk about a Cambrian moment in terms of brand new cloud native applications being built, and there's so many of them. But then I think you're also pointing out there's a healthy number of applications which are getting refactored and were born maybe in the VM hypervisor environment and now are moving in. And I know there are a lot of industry tailwinds. VMware, for example, working with things like Tanzu to go ahead and provide a path to support that. And of course, Kasten's been helping out with that. But also you can bring your own Kubernetes on top of vSphere environments also, and that helps organizations too. And I think that really is a good, healthy mix. And we definitely see that adoption both for new applications as well as sort of refactored applications. So I think that's indeed fascinating to see that up into the right, like I was pointing out. To maybe ask a common question that I get a lot, Krista, and I know it's probably close to your heart, is can't customers just rely on replication and resiliency when it comes to data protection? Because I know that's what we're talking about in this webinar. So maybe if you can add a little more color about that.
Sure, yeah, and it's a great question, and we certainly get asked this a lot as well. And really, in my mind, the big reason why application resiliency or even replication isn't sort of the only solution in terms of protection, and that reason is recoverability. So application resiliency is intended to keep the application itself up and running. And it doesn't protect against data loss or against data that has been compromised. And the reason why this is a big deal is because of ransomware and all these other cyber attacks that I'm sure everybody on the line, I'm sure is very familiar with, hearing the stats in the headlines just about how prevalent ransomware attacks have become these days, and some of the dollar figures attached with either the fees that are being paid or the downtime and the data loss. So it's very important to be able to have those backup copies available to recover as a little bit of an insurance policy there. I mean, it really is, it's just sort of a best practice that we would certainly always advise customers.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. I always say that your backup is only as good as your recovery, because at the end of the day, that's the reason you're backing up. And hopefully you don't need to get into situations, but we know that organizations need that. And I think, as you pointed out, when it comes to replication, you can replicate your errors. If you mistakenly go delete a file, you actually have that replicated everywhere. So that definitely isn't the same as backup, but I know that causes confusion. So, with that said, though, I guess if we dive in deeper and we talk about data protection in this growing Kubernetes environment that you pointed out, maybe if you can talk about what should be the key considerations that an organization needs to keep in mind to have their applications up and running and actually protected so that you can, have a good night's sleep.
Sure, absolutely. And this is something, so at eValuator Group, we work very regularly with, IT infrastructure clients around really some of their biggest pain points. And so when it comes to this space in particular, we are doing quite a bit of work around that. And I would say the first thing that comes to mind for me really is the ability to be able to protect the entire namespace. So what this means is that it certainly is very important to protect the persistent data itself, right? We kind of just talked about the need for recoverability, for example. But the data itself is not sufficient to get the application back up and running, right? So there are a number of other components that are required in order to get really, at the end of the day, that business service back up and running. And I have a few examples here. This isn't necessarily a comprehensive list, but it's a few of the bigger ones that we tend to hear about. The first one being databases. So in the Kubernetes world, etcd is the most common one. This stores all of the metadata for the Kubernetes cluster, and so it's required for locating different data and objects for different tasks within the cluster, like scheduling coordination and things of that nature. We have another example, resource definitions. These are objects that essentially extend the Kubernetes API so that the user can introduce their own API into the cluster. And especially considering all the application development that's going on and things like that, and the need to tie in with external tools, that's certainly important. Configuration data, things like config maps, which sort of serve as almost a dictionary, if you will, of the configuration settings. Kubernetes secrets are a big deal. These store sensitive pieces of data like usernames, tokens, keys, passwords, obviously very important information. And really just any related dependencies, so any other components or services that are needed to kind of get that application or that business service back online are important. I pulled together a few others as well. So coordinated application recovery, this is somewhat similar to that protection of the entire namespace. What this means is getting all of those different piece parts of the application back up and running correctly and in the right order. This really can help to streamline that recovery process for customers. The Kubernetes native support, Gaurav, I know you and the Kasten team can talk quite a bit about this. That certainly can streamline administration for IT operations. And then the third bullet here is one that I hear time and time again. I hear all the time from customers, the ability to have that mobility of the data and of the application across different clusters within the Kubernetes environment, but also across different cloud providers, across on and off-prem, across different distributions of Kubernetes as well. And that's because when you have a use case like DR and the need to fail over, or the need to be able to move an application from test into production, for example, or even just the need to update to a new distribution or a new version of Kubernetes. That's very important to be able to have that mobility and flexibility. And just in general, we see that customers don't want to be locked into one particular environment or provider. And a few other items. So we did already talk a little bit about ransomware, but just to sort of talk about some capabilities in particular that jump out, that tend to come up in conversation. So we have here granular recovery options. So that is the ability to, for example, recover one specific file that was impacted by ransomware. And then as a result of that, perhaps be able to get back online more quickly and really just have a little bit more of a surgical approach, if you will, to the recovery process, depending on what has been impacted. We have as well immutability, encryption. I mean, these are simply, they're just table stakes today. They really can go far in terms of helping to avoid malicious tampering with files or deleting files or things of that nature. And complementing that a little bit is access control. So you do want to have different capabilities in place to prevent bad actors from accessing that data to begin with. And that's important, especially because we're seeing a lot of ransomware attacks are being designed to attack the backup environment, because the attacker knows that if the customer has their backups to recover from, they don't need to pay the ransom. So we're seeing them being designed to attack the backup environment, and even data exfiltration, where there's this threat of, you know, selling or exposing customer data, going beyond just encrypting it if a fee isn't paid. So very important to make sure that you know, those access control measures are in place. And so for yeah.
No, these are really meaty points that you made,
you.
and that's a lot of ground you covered, Krista. So so indeed, I was going to maybe just say that you talked about your point that, look, you need to cover the entire namespace, and I know we talk a lot about the applications become the unit of atomicity in this context. And not your hypervisors anymore. You might not even have a VM that your container is running on. It might be directly on bare metal. So I think your point about getting the data as well as all the associated metadata that makes up an application is truly important. I think the point you made about having Kubernetes native, and I think you put up a slide about how Kasten does it. And so maybe happy to talk about some of this in terms of the learnings we've had talking to customers and all the deployments that we've had across various geographies and customers of various sizes. The Kubernetes native point that you made, just to touch on that, that's extremely important, because you pointed out in your first slide about Kubernetes sort of increasing and the benefits and the kind of workloads. The point to also make is Kubernetes is a technology, but I think we joke internally, it's also a mindset. And what I mean by that is it comes with its own development processes. It's much faster. It's microservices based. The tools that you use in a Kubernetes native environment for doing things like observability and people wiring up, let's say, PagerDuty to whatever your monitoring tools are, so that you can set up your organization to react quickly to any issues, are very different from what we might have seen in sort of the legacy world. So from a perspective of a data protection tool, the reason it's important to be Kubernetes native is that you need to go ahead and make sure you're not trying to fit, a square into a round peg, or the right analog here. The point is you want to fit exactly into the ecosystem that the organizations are moving into, and then doing it in a way where it's actually using the Kubernetes RBAC constructs, so that you can get to the points that I think you were alluding to, even when it comes to things like ransomware protection and recovery, which of course are making headlines every day, unfortunately. So I think, to me, Kubernetes native, we can go on. I know we're going to be short on this, but it's a really important point when you're making a choice of using the right tool in this environment. I think you also pointed out this point around databases when you're doing the protection. I know, talking to customers and additional surveys, one of the most important workloads when you drill into what the applications are made of in Kubernetes world turn out to be databases. These include SQL as well as NoSQL databases, whether it's a Mongo or a PostgreSQL, and it keeps growing, that list. So what you need to do is, when you have a serious backup tool that you need to invest in as an organization, it's not okay to just be able to go ahead and say, I'm going to be doing storage level snapshots, because maybe your application requirements when you're doing backups won't be satisfied, because there might be still stuff written in memory but hasn't been flushed into disk. So the level of granularity and the level of consistency that you require is something that you can achieve only if you're also operating at the database level. So we call these logical database backups. And I think at a part of Kasten K10, we have the flexibility of going ahead and backing up applications, not only at the storage level with snapshots and integrations to a wide variety of storage partners there, but also with a growing number of database vendors. So you might, under the covers, employ the native APIs that the database vendors themselves go ahead and expose, so that you, as a customer, just go ahead and set a policy saying that I want a high level of consistency for this particular application or that namespace, and then just set the RPO, RTO requirements in some ways of how often you want that backed up and how quickly you could then go and recover it. And that's really important with this multi-layered consistency point. And I think this point about you pointed about the not getting locked into a vendor solution. To me, that's even more important in the Kubernetes world, because the other thing that we've noticed is Kubernetes brought with it the promise of portability. And so I think you pointed out you need to move between clusters and maybe between Kubernetes environments. And what that means is you cannot go ahead and depend on a solution which ties you to a particular storage option or to a particular Kubernetes distribution. You want to be able to go ahead and have that portability where when you do take a backup, but when the time comes to rehydrate and bring back your application, it could be a completely different environment where the storage classes might have changed. You might have developed your application using spinning media on premises, but when you actually want to go ahead and recover, it might be on AWS using EKS, and it might be EBS as the underlying storage. So we see this sort of rich matrix of things changing, and Kasten K10 really doesn't tie you to a particular infrastructure or a particular cloud, and that freedom of choice is important to keep that portability point as well as your costs low so that you don't get locked in. And then finally, I think from our perspective, DevOps speed and scale really is the new tooling. I think people are moving to Kubernetes because they want to take advantages of feature velocity and having a way to be able to have self-service portals, which ties back to the points I think you were talking about in terms of having the right authentication mechanisms, etc. And that's something that we were also born with as a part of Kasten K10. And that's how we see our customers going ahead and employing it, where you don't need to go and create tickets just to be able to back up applications or recover applications when need be. And so I think that turns out to be another sort of building block when it comes with the Kasten K10 hat on, and how that ties into, I think, the points you made about what needs to be kept front and center. So I think with that said, Carissa, going back to you on this one, let's just maybe switch gears a little bit, and you talk about sort of DevSecOps and so on. Talk about a little bit in terms of the various data protection approaches that you sort of see, and in this context, maybe a little more color there.
Sure. So I know we had a couple of slides here, certainly kind of that influence of DevOps, as you mentioned, we see that being very strong. So, essentially the way I would sum it up is there's a little bit of a push and pull in terms of IT still needs to have that control over the backup processes. So making sure that there are those recovery points that are there and things of that nature. But at the same time, they need to be able to have that control in a way that's not going to get, in the way of DevOps teams and not going to slow them down, right? So that's where some of these automation capabilities automatically discover applications, apply those protection policies that are set by IT, automate backup jobs and recovery processes so that they're not impeding those DevOps processes is very important. And similarly, being able to give a little bit of self-service and autonomy, I know you kind of fleshed this out a little bit with the Kasten K10 capabilities, but certainly, self-service recoveries, dashboards that are easy to use and intuitive for DevOps teams, certainly. And I know you kind of referenced, RBAC, identity access management, some of those, access controls as well. So, certainly would, agree with that as well. And I do believe that we wanted to maybe get a little audience participation here and bring up our poll just sort of around, some of the ways in which, companies are using containers today, specifically as it relates to the audience on the line today.
Yeah, I see it pulls up in terms of the use of containers. I hope people can click and talk about what might be driving your context. It's always good to learn. So we'll wait for that to go ahead and get folks a few minutes to get that going. And I think just to talk a little bit about the points you were making around DevSecOps, and I think I see some questions about what does DevSecOps mean? And I think we have. So maybe Krista, if you don't mind, add a question while you're waiting for the poll.
Sure.
For you, what does DevSecOps actually mean if you have to define it simply?
Sure. So from my perspective, it's all about sort of integrating security as a part of the DevOps processes. And I would say, probably in particular as a part of that, CI/CD kind of development pipeline. So being able to have, sort of these access controls, some of these different, kind of checks and security measures throughout the process to, again, really build that security in from the ground up as opposed to sort of having it bolt on. That's the way I would sort of net it out. I'm not sure if you've had anything to add on top of that, Gaurav.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on the things I would have said, which is essentially, I think the big shift I see is security is becoming a shared responsibility. If I had to sort of go ahead and talk about it in the old world, or, you almost thought about security as an afterthought, as a day two operation that the IT guys would take care of. I think what we are seeing now is not only is your development processes where your developers are almost have a hand in operations of that application, even security, when we think about it, is sort of proverbially shifting left, where you think about weaving in some of these security constructs right at development time. So for example, when you're going ahead and creating an object storage bucket, make sure that you have encryption turned on. And then when it comes to having it run in production, again, you have a variety of things that you need to take care of in terms of network segmentation. And I know the NSA just came up with the second version of keeping your environment secure operationally. So to me, DevSecOps really is catching that philosophy. I was joking that Kubernetes is also a state of mind. And I think this is really a good example of practices that need to be shared in your organization to make sure that security is not just an IT problem. It's something that just continues and happens pre-production as well as in production. And there is indeed fluidity to it. So to me, that's really important, and we can talk a little more. So I do see some poll results. Maybe Krista, I don't know if you see it. We can definitely.
I do. Yes. Yeah, I see 42% to support production cloud native applications in terms of containers.
Yeah. No, I think, and I see a really big number for workload migration on and off-prem. So yeah, I think the points we were hitting about having that portability constructs and freedom of choice seems to be really important.
Yeah.
If you have things in production, then hopefully, so far we've been able to get and make the point that don't just rely on replication or application resiliency, make sure you have backup in place. So I think that's a key one for sure.
Absolutely.
So maybe we should move on to the next step around this one. And I think Krista, here I just wanted to maybe highlight a couple of things when it comes to these DevOps practices and where we see Kubernetes expanding into. And interestingly, while Kubernetes might have been born in the cloud in context of things where Google open sourced the project, etc., very quickly it found its way into data centers, and you see key Kubernetes distributions like OpenShift out there. But now we're also seeing Kubernetes sort of seep into the edges. And I know it's a overloaded terminology, whether it's a place where you might have a retail store, or you might have a floating ship defined as an edge, or an IoT sort of use case. In all of those cases, the point to be made is you have locations which have low compute, maybe intermittent network connectivity resources, but yet you want to take advantages of all the things that Kubernetes brings in. So another way we see DevOps practices, etc., fit in is you might have different Kubernetes distributions. So K3s, for example, has been focused on going after the edge, or we see even things like EKS Anywhere come in and move from the cloud and are now actually more capable to be running on premises and come with optimized operating systems like BottleRocket, which I know Kasten K10 was a launch partner on, that give you that additional level of security. And from a practice of going ahead and backing up, you're not just backing up applications inside your cloud or your data center. Now you need to also go ahead and make sure you're backing up your applications even at these edges. And you do need to have a way to be able to easily set these policies that say, go ahead and make sure these applications are protected regardless of where they are. So they need to be global in nature. And that's something definitely that Kasten K10 supports to work in this multi-cluster environment. But at the same time, you also want to go ahead and maybe have the flexibility of saying, for this particular cluster in this location, I want to set an overriding local policy in terms of the frequency of operations of how and where things need to be backed up. And that's something that is supported too from a Kasten perspective across a growing number of these Kubernetes environments. So to us, when we talk about DevOps or DevSecOps, it's also weaving in the point that you need to think about it not only in the context of one environment, but multiple environments. And this trend is definitely growing with the point I'm making about edge. So maybe that's really the key point. But with all of that said, in terms of what needs to be protected, why it needs to be protected, some of the trends, we can now maybe switch gears, Krista, and talk a little bit about, from your perspective, when you look at the landscape, what would you say are the key categories of approaches that organizations have when they're thinking about data protection tools and to solve the problem we talked about?
Sure. Yeah, so we're seeing really three key approaches today. We're seeing that customers are working with what we're calling, the first-party platform providers that are providing the Kubernetes kind of distributions and platforms, but they're also providing at least a degree of data protection and management capabilities on top of that. We are seeing usage of some open source platforms as well. And then we're seeing companies use what we are calling kind of third-party platforms. So these are, third-party data protection solutions. We really consider them to be sort of enterprise-grade. Kasten K10 is a great example of that. So just to, I guess, sort of net it out a little bit, again, those first-party platforms, those are the providers like Google that are providing, again, those Kubernetes distributions with some data protection and management on top. One of the challenges that we see with those approaches is that they are exclusive to that specific platform. So when we talk about customers wanting to use, kind of a multi-cloud type implementation, or, have that flexibility, avoid that lock-in that we've been talking about, that's where that becomes a little bit of a challenge. And we also see that a lot of these platforms are built on some of the open source tools that we'll talk about in a minute. And so some of those, inherent gaps or sort of challenges are going to persist within this sort of category as well.
Yeah, no, I think
when we look at
sorry, go ahead. I think
no, sure. I was just going to make some comments on the open source. So I'm not sure if you had anything else to chime in regarding kind of
No,
the
I was
first
all I
party
was going to say on
providers.
the first party. I think you hit on the point. It goes against that first order principles of having that portability, which I think we saw in our poll results too.
Yes,
So that's a really
yeah.
important one to keep in mind when
It
you're thinking about data protection.
it's yeah, certainly the critical thing, to think about there for sure. And when we look at the open source, so we've been talking a lot about DevOps, and due to that influence, we are seeing that it's very common to have this sort of do-it-yourself DIY approach. Use some open source tools. Valero is a very common one, to be able to sort of, create or script, these data protection, data management capabilities. And the challenge is that these tend to be very difficult to work with. I know our team at Evaluator Group has done some hands-on work. And for example, we find that the setup, for example, is very difficult to navigate. So it's just not as easy and seamless. And we see that there's a greater tendency to rely on, as I kind of alluded to rely on scripting versus maybe automation or other pre-built capabilities. So that becomes very time consuming, which adds to operational expense. And it also increases risk for human error, which can in turn create some, data exposure, data protection gaps, which, certainly is a big risk, especially with ransomware and the other cyber attacks that we've been talking about. And we also see that they just aren't as enterprise grade in terms of the features that they have. So they don't have, for example, some of those RBAC constructs that we've been talking about. They might not have some of those operational dashboards, right, for control and for oversight. And they might not have those multi-cluster operations that we see IT looking for. So certainly kind of a number of gaps there.
Yeah,
So
I
Gaurav,
think
I'm
the
not
only
sure if
comment
you had
I'll
any
make on
other
that one,
comments. Yeah.
Krista, was going to be for open source. I think organizations are increasingly realizing that, the point I think you already made, that backups are not only critical, but you need to also think about recovery. And so if you're going to be focusing all your efforts in trying to create runbooks and do-it-yourself scripts, which not only are error-prone, but end up taking time, you obviously then lose out on doing the core work of focusing on the core business applications. And I think we see that as being a driver, in addition to the fact that it's just not enterprise ready, and you at times can lose data, which is the worst thing a backup product can do, to be honest. And so so indeed that turns out to be a big issue when it comes to sort of just trying to wrap up scripts, and it becomes even more complex, which hopefully becomes quite apparent when we talked about the fact that Kubernetes is now moving into different locations, going all the way to the edges. So imagine doing the scripting for every environment and then multiplying it as you have a variety of distributions and storage vendors. So indeed a complex option. So sorry, I'll let you go to option number 3 then.
No, no, you hit on important points there. And, I think that leads us into, I know you've kind of introduced folks on the line to Kasten K10. As I mentioned, it's a great example of one of these third-party tools that does have, those more robust capabilities, like that heterogeneous support that we've been talking about, like that streamlined installation and management, and those security controls. So those are really some of the critical gaps that we see, Kasten K10, a tool like that kind of step up and be able to deliver, really to this space.
So I think, Krista, from my perspective, I know I can talk a lot about Kasten K10, but you've looked at Kasten K10 and independently sort of evaluated it. So from your perspective, when you try and take the constructs that are really important for a data protection piece and the customer benefits that K10 provides, maybe if you can spend a few minutes just talking about what it is that you saw from your point of view that made Kasten K10 a good fit.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few items here, certainly. I guess taking a step back, if I really did have to kind of net it out, I would say two of the big things, number one being that portability. I know we've both sort of continued to really drive that home. It's just such a critical requirement that we hear from customers across those various environments. So that certainly is one thing that jumped out. And then really the ability to overcome, I sort of look at it as a skills gap. That might be a little bit of a harsher terminology, but we talked on the previous slide about sort of, the DIY scripting and some of the challenges that's inherent with that. But being able to overcome some of those challenges and, for example, have those automation capabilities for the discovery, for example, of the entire application and all of its dependencies, and really have that confidence in ensuring that everything that's needed to be protected is going to be protected. And also to have that streamlined, installation up front and have some streamlined administration as well, I would say is very important, because that saves time at the end of the day, which we all know is critical for all IT teams. And, when we look at K10 as well, there is very broad support, right, in terms of, I look at it as the sources that can be protected, so different Kubernetes distributions and things of that nature, as well as the different targets that can be supported. And when we're referring to a target, we mean the storage repository that the backup copies are being sent to. And we also mean the secondary location that the application or the data is going to be, failed over to or recovered into. It is important to have that flexibility there to be able to meet, really whatever need that the customer might be able to require. And I would say as well, again, I'll bring back home that security, those security constructs. Those, again, are critical just to make sure that those bad actors are not penetrating the environment, or if they are being able to penetrate the environment for some reason, there are capabilities like that immutability, for example, and for example, those granular recovery capabilities as well, to be able to get back and running in the event that an attack were to happen. So those are really kind of top of mind, a number of the things that sort of jump out to me in particular about the solution.
Yeah, so I got a ping saying maybe we should also throw up another poll question, just to
Sure.
learn more about our audience. So maybe that's a cue for the team here. And this one is unfortunately a single choice. So pick up your most pressing one. I'm sure in a lot of cases you might need to protect Kubernetes for multiple reasons that we touched on, but I think this will be an interesting one too. So while folks are clicking on this one, I think Krista, all of these are great points around what makes Kasten K10 a good fit. The one point I do want to highlight though is I'm noticing that the Kubernetes, while you and I might be talking about Kubernetes and we've used the word many times in this presentation, it's still a very new skill and a new technology base. So I think one measure of that is every time you go to KubeCon, hopefully physical one this time, not virtual, but the number of people who are attending the show for the very first time is a really large number, which is just an indicator to the fact that a lot of people are just coming into the ecosystem, and not only is it healthy because it's growing, but a lot of new people are driving that growth. So what that drives into from a Kubernetes data protection perspective is simplicity. You want a tool that doesn't need you to become a Kubernetes expert on day one to be able to help secure your applications and then to be able to recover them. So I think one thing which I'm really proud of the development team on our side is the fact that you talked about a single click or a single command to get applications like Kasten K10 installed in a Kubernetes cluster. It takes less than 5 minutes. It automatically discovers the applications. It can even suggest, based on the application makeup, that it goes and interrogates the Kubernetes API server to say, well, I detect that there might be this particular database and this is the makeup. You can set policies and it'll automatically start protecting that and putting them into resilient stores like object stores or NFS, or even the Veeam backup and replication piece, which we announced for vSphere environments. So I think to me, just getting up and running and to get productive is really one of the key points without needing to become a Kubernetes expert. So just to add to that list, that's important. All right. So I think in terms of the poll, we'll let it. Well, what do I see? All right. I'll let you read that one, Krista, again.
This is interesting. So when we discussed this question, I know we were kind of talking about ransomware and just how top of mind that is, and I think certainly that's evident here, right? Approximately 1 in 4 selected that ransomware resiliency as the most important, kind of, I guess, data protection use case or requirement for Kubernetes. But getting the application back up and running as quickly as possible, selected by 65%. I mean, to me, that's telling in terms of what the downtime following an attack or following just any type of an outage, right? Just what that downtime costs the organization in terms of productivity, in terms of relationships with their customers. To me, that's really what that hits home, and I think that's very interesting.
Got it. No, I agree. All right. So I know we are also running short of time. So maybe I think we had a last slide to cover, and then maybe we should try and open it up for questions after that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this one is important because, like the poll said, ransomware is definitely top of mind. To be able to back up easily and recover quickly is definitely one of the key ones. And then if I really dive under the covers, what that really means is you need to have these deep and wide ecosystem integrations, which Cast and K10 does. I think I made the point that you're not locked into a particular distribution. So if you decide to go ahead and use Red Hat OpenShift, or if you decide to use a public cloud with Azure, or use EKS or GKE or Tanzu, I think in all of those cases, Kasten has these automated tests going every night, which go and make sure that every release of Kasten K10 is integrated and tested across a growing number of use cases across this. But also we are integrated into the underlying storage ecosystem, whether it's a block, file, or object. We do support direct integrations as well as CSI integrations. And this again spans on-premises vendors, whether it's HPE or Pure, or cloud vendors, whether it's Amazon EBS or Azure Disks, etc. And then I think I was making this point around multi-layered consistency. Because databases is where you end up having a lot of your critical application data stored, and you need to make sure you're able to recover from that. We support both databases that might be instantiated in your Kubernetes clusters, as well as database as a service or managed databases like Amazon RDS that you might be consuming from your application. So we can also use, like I was pointing out, databases, backup and recovery native APIs to get you that logical level of consistency, in addition to making sure we support the consistency at the snapshot level. And so this growing list of ecosystem vendors that we are deeply integrated with is ultimately what gets you the right level of immutability, the right level of snapshot efficiency, things like change block tracking. And that's really what is the magic behind the scenes, that we hide the complexity, obviously, from the users to make it simple, but still give you that point of getting the top two things and the portability, which still turns out to be important. So to me, that's maybe just another point to keep in mind around Kasten K10 and why, when we looked at the different approaches, option 3 turns out to be the key one when it comes to customer choices across a wide variety of industries. So with 10 minutes to go, I think, Krista, maybe what I was going to do is any parting thoughts from you. Otherwise, I was going to hand it back to Tom and see if we can open it up to question and answers.
Yeah, I think just, real quick for me, I think the summary is that, container adoption is here, it's here to stay, and the data protection is very important. You don't want to be caught, having been hit by ransomware, or just in general having a case where you can't recover your data or get your application and business services back online. That is absolutely critical. There are a number of kind of different complexities pertaining to containers that have to be considered. And that's why it really is important to have a tool that's been designed to protect container environments and be able to have these capabilities like the application mobility that we talked about, like those concerted concepts, for example. So that would be the takeaway for me.
All right. No, I completely agree. This is a lot of ground we covered. I think all the way from why you need backups, what are the considerations, how can you do it, why cast and kitten fits, and we got to learn about the audience too. But let me hand it over to Tom now.
All right, thank you, Gaurav. Well, first of all, both of you, thank you for a super interesting webinar. I really love the content. That was great. But what I wanted to say was, and I was going a bit quicker than I wanted there, I'm just blown away by the questions and the quality of the questions that we've been getting from the audience. I really see that people were paying attention, that they're very interested in this topic. So this is amazing. We only have 7 minutes, folks. There will be follow-ups after this with questions that did not get addressed. We're also working on an FAQ page. We're working on it. It's going to come out in a few weeks where we can address more of those questions on our website. But let me get to a few, and maybe just an easy one to get started with, because that was the first one I saw also. Bob was asking whether governments are embracing Kubernetes or if this is mostly a private sector thing.
I can take that, and so you can definitely add. So we definitely see the government. I think they've been actually publicly talking about it in some of the KubeCon sessions. The Air Force, for example, on the US side has kind of adopted and has been quite vocal about it. So Kubernetes, I think, is definitely not specific to the private sector. We are seeing, this being adopted definitely across the Department of Defense and all the 3-letter acronyms that you can think about in the context of the government in this case.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think what I would chime in there is that there are some capabilities like that increased resiliency, for example, and the ability to have those, very dedicated microservices for increased security, for example, that certainly would be beneficial to the government sector.
All right. Also, thank you, Krista and Gaurav. And I'm seeing a comment from someone asking us to make a podcast for these presentations. Actually, that's something that we've been debating on, and we will be working on that pretty soon. So thank you for that feedback as well. Another question I got from, if I wrote that correctly, Surav, that person is asking, what different methods can we adopt to secure the Kubernetes control plane components or master nodes? And there seems to be a bit of a level of frustration there because we're always talking about securing the data plane and just the worker nodes or components. So pretty sure that you guys have a good answer for that one.
Yeah, Krista, I can take a quick stab and I'll let you add to it.
Sure.
So I think you obviously need to handle both, right? I think Krista was talking about the fact that you want to go ahead and protect the entire sort of application or namespace in this construct. And when you look at Kubernetes, not only do you have to protect, like you said, some of the stateful application data that is in databases and so on, and we spent a lot of time. But it's also a lot of when you look at the control plane related components and break it out into pieces, there is the network information, the config information related to things like secrets, etc. Today, that's sort of stored in your etcd database. What we recommend is not necessarily backing up etcd as is, but backing up the contents of the etcd in an intelligent fashion so that you keep the portability aspects of being able to rehydrate it in a different place. So that's really important too. In terms of just a backup point of view. I think your question might have been a little more broad to also talk about securing Kubernetes control planes. And there is a whole operational practice. So maybe what we can also do is, as a follow-up, share with you some of the operational best practices around security for that. And that's probably a follow-up. So I'll just pause there. Krista, anything from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, Gaurav, and I certainly agree. I think it's a pretty broad topic, big question, and I think certainly something that we could spend quite a bit more time than the 4 minutes that we unfortunately have remaining talking about. But as you mentioned, making sure that those different, for example, network configuration components are protected. And I mean, I would go back to just having, kind of the smart access controls and things like that. That can go a long way. That can go a long way as well, is I think the only thing I'd add to that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And another interesting question, maybe a little bit less backup oriented, but I think it will be a good one for Krista. Pragya was asking whether we could recommend an effective strategy for solving the complexity of Kubernetes and what platforms would be needed to leverage it.
Sure. So platforms, and I apologize, I don't see the question here, but platforms required to address the complexity of Kubernetes?
So let me repeat the question. So can you recommend an
Sure.
effective strategy for solving the complexity of Kubernetes? And then a side question was, what platforms would be needed for that?
Sure. So, and again, I think this question might kind of go beyond the scope of kind of just data protection in particular. With the Evaluator Group, we do have some research on container management platforms in general. We've really been building out this coverage. So certainly I'd want to follow up and sort of connect you with my colleague, Janae Stoll-Lee, is the one that kind of leads that area of research in terms of, again, kind of that general perspective on Kubernetes and container management. Looking at data protection in particular, I would say that there certainly are complexities, especially when you think about all of these different, components that go into the application itself and the namespace that need to be protected. And especially when you think about, simply how dynamic these environments tend to be, with containers being, created, spun up and spun down very quickly, with the need for all of this mobility that we've been talking about. And so that's where these best practices that we've been talking about really come into play in terms of, backing up everything that's needed, appropriately, with the required recovery points, things like that become important. Things like, again, having those security constructs becomes important so that the environment's not penetrated. Just are a few things that are top of mind. Hopefully that helps as a starting point.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I wanted to add one more follow-up question, but I'm seeing that we're running out of time. So I would like to thank both of you for your time, for an incredibly interesting webinar. I want to thank everybody attending for being here with us and for the many great questions that we got. And then the moment that you're all waiting for, there is a raffle winner.